Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Uber has lost an appeal against a ruling on the employment rights of its drivers. The minicab app was challenging the idea that its workers are classified as employees. LBC's Lucy Hoff reports from the Employment Appeal Tribunal in London.
This decision comes a year after the taxi service challenged a court ruling brought by two of its drivers who argued they were employees and should be entitled to minimum wage, sick pay and paid holiday. But today a judge has ruled against the taxi app and the case is now expected to go to the Court of Appeal.
And in the last few minutes, Uber has said it will appeal against today's ruling.
Go on then, we'll prove how fleet of foot we are and the benefits of not having a programme built around the availability of the political editor of the Daily Bugle or some no-mark MP who's desperate for a little bit of attention by completely changing what we were intending to talk about next as a result of what we just heard in the news bulletin. Uber is appealing. There's a phrase you don't hear very often on this programme unless it's in the context of courts. They tried to classify their UK drivers, you'll remember, in last year as self-employed. They lost. They have very deep pockets, Uber. The rest of us wouldn't necessarily have recourse to appeal if we were to come up on the wrong end of a very expensive legal case. Having lost that, they appealed, and now they've lost the appeal. This is the ruling that it should treat its drivers as workers rather than self-employed. Now, I guess I'd like to say at this point that when you change direction on a conversation with sort of only a nanosecond's notice, it means that you don't really know what question you're going to pose, but I often find myself ending up in that position even when I've had 3 hours to prepare my opening comments on a subject. I don't like Uber. But I struggle to win arguments about why I don't like Uber with people who just see it as an inevitable upshot of technological advance. The reason I don't like Uber, and I think to my embarrassment, I've taken my foot off the pedal on this somewhat because so many of the vilest comments that we receive or I receive personally seem to come from taxi drivers when it comes to issues of race and immigration and Islam. But I can't do the opposite of what I tell everybody else to do all the time. I can't change my views on a cause simply because of the identity of the people associated with it, and I probably get 4 to 1 more positive. Certainly no one ever pulls their taxi over in the street to offer me a free ride because they hate me. They generally only ever do that to say thank you for standing up against Uber. But the reason I don't like Uber isn't necessarily the reason that Sadiq Khan and TfL are poised to withdraw their licence. The reason I don't like Uber is because I think that taxi drivers have been shafted in the most unfair and deliberate of ways. For me, the problem with Uber is that when you do the knowledge, you are essentially signing a contract. Bits of it are formal and bits of it are informal. And among the formal bits is the very simple rule that no one else is allowed to ply for hire and no one else is allowed to respond to a hail. And the last legal code, the first legal battle that was brought by the cab drivers that they lost was an attempt to argue that pressing a button on your phone is the 21st century equivalent of sticking your hand in the air on your street. To me, the judge, and I normally, again, this is a veritable cornucopia of hypocrisy and self-contradiction. Normally, I'm very dismissive of journalists who think they know better than judges, but I've read every single word of the judgment handed down in this case, and I'm here to tell you I think I do know better than the judge. I think he got distracted by the fact that Uber's lawyers argued that because the motherboard, if you will, the server is based in San Francisco, there's no earthly way that you could hail a car on the streets of London if the technological transaction had to be processed via a server in San Francisco. But I have to remind you that High Court judges have also issued phrases in their past, including "what is the Beatles?" and various other questions that have displayed on an almost unbelievable level their ignorance of modern mores and technology. So I think, for the record, that judgment was wrong, and that went in Uber's favour. I stand in the street, press a button on my phone, and a car pulls up 30 seconds later. What is the difference substantively between standing in the street, sticking my hand in the air when I see a car with a light, a taxi with a light on the top, pulling up alongside me? So if I had spent £40,000 and 3 years setting myself up as a taxi driver on the proviso and understanding that for the rest of my natural life, me and my colleagues in the hackney carriage trade would be the only people in this town allowed to ply for hire, I'd be pretty blinking furious if some billionaires from Silicon Valley came along with a computer program that allowed everybody with a Prius and an easily achieved PHV license to do effectively exactly what I could do. But that's a really lonely furrow. Even when you canvass support in opposition to Uber, it's more likely to be over the 0 hours contract nature of their employment, over the apparent exploitation of the drivers, over the very real fact that not long from now they're all going to be replaced by driverless cars anyway, and what Uber are doing is essentially laying the foundations for a driverless empire that would see almost all the money that hasn't been spent on establishing the vehicles making its way into the pockets of shareholders. That's not necessarily, I don't know that any two arguments about Uber have ever been the same, actually, in my experience. But just for the record, my opposition to the technology is not built upon an opposition to modernity. It's built upon a profound belief that if you start changing the terms and conditions which people signed up for when they started a job, then everything goes out of the window. It was Liam Fox, of course, who argued before the Brexit referendum was underway that the only way we could restore British competitiveness on the international stage was by removing workplace regulations. Be under no illusions what these arch Brexiters are about. Removing workplace regulations, removing protections for workers, removing any attempt to prioritise the worker over the investor. You saw it yesterday with the railway strike. Right-wing media piling in on train drivers who'd managed to secure a pay rise that brought their annual income to a tiny fraction of the CEO of the owner parent company with profits of £100 million. And all the passengers are thinking, oh, fares are going to go up because the drivers have got a pay rise, because that's what right-wing media is telling them, without telling them that the company that owns Southern Rail made £100 million last year. Oh, hang on, if they made how can you get paid that sort of money for driving a train, say people who aren't realising that they're defending people getting paid 10 times more money for doing absolutely nothing except being rich in the first place and investing? This is the big drum that's going to need thumping as Brexit looms ever closer, because that is what they want to do. That is what they want to do. It's a threat to every working person in this country. If you can't see it now, I'm not sure you ever will. Oh, down with unions. Even the kind of immigration obsessives who believe the lie put out there that immigration has demonstrably lowered wages, even they don't see how profoundly they're being shafted by right-wing politicians, because the same politicians that tell you the lie that your wages have been deflated by immigration are the same ones that tell you that trade unions are bad. With a strong trade union, nobody could undercut anybody, whether they came from Kuala Lumpur or Kidderminster. With a strong trade union and collective bargaining in place in any workplace, it would be impossible to bring in someone else on less, because everybody would down tools immediately until that person was put on the same wage as everybody else. But hey, it's a lonely voice explaining the simple logic of rationality and fact in the face of the screaming, emotive bile of right-wing journalists. But that's why, on Uber, I think it is relevant to every working person in the country that a massive international conglomerate backed by the full might of BlackRock and Goldman Sachs. Don't forget that George Osborne gets paid £1 zillion a minute by one of Uber's biggest shareholders while also editing the London Evening Standard. So don't necessarily expect to see a full and frank account of this story in their pages later today. As long as that happens, these battles are important. But I don't want to have that battle today. 13 minutes after 11 is the time. If Uber has to classify its drivers as workers, if Uber has to give its workers holiday pay and minimum wage, I don't think it will survive. I think it flies in the face of their entire raison d'etre. And if they can't do that, then what happens next? I genuinely don't know. 11-13, they lost, they appealed. They lost the appeal, they'll appeal again. But the bottom line is this: if you are an Uber driver, you are employed by Uber. That's what the courts keep finding. And if you're employed by Uber, then Uber have certain responsibilities to you, the kind of responsibilities that Brexit politicians want to remove. But under the law as it stands, those responsibilities remain. And okay, let's just do it straight. There are a couple of shills out there. I don't normally buy into this, but every single time I've heard other presenters on LBC do this subject, the same two voices pop up claiming that they absolutely love the insecurity that being an Uber driver provides. Let's see if we can tempt them out of the woodwork again and see if you can spot them without me telling you that it's them. But there is obviously an ear on this radio station at Uber headquarters because, well, you know there is, because it's the biggest news outlet in London. It was previously specific to London. Obviously, we're national now, and it's usually a forum in which this argument achieves more attention because of the number of taxi drivers listening than it does anywhere else. So on this one, I don't care whether you drive a taxi or a unicycle, they're not self-employed by any reasonable definition of the phrase. Uber drivers are not self-employed. And for every shill you can find claiming that they absolutely love the freedom of not having holiday pay or minimum wage legislation, I would presume there are 100 drivers saying, well, yeah, I mean, as long as it's pro rata, then I would love the protection that these laws provide. The problem is, I think, if you've got 1,000 drivers sitting around waiting for a job while not being paid, how do you calculate minimum wage? That's why I think this would finish the company, in London at least, in Britain at least, if they lose their next appeal. Because you sit there, I don't know quite how likely it is for every person that rings in claiming that they've made £300,000 in the last 10 minutes as a direct result of Uber being brilliant. Presumably there are a lot of people who are doing it more out of necessity than choice. It's one of the few ways you can bring in money. And you sit there hoping for a job while not being paid. So you are available and ready for work, but you're not being paid. And the work sees some money go to Uber. So a black cab driver on the rank waiting for work is self-employed. He's made that choice. I see a profound difference, but I appreciate that you may not. Should we get the phone lines open? Yeah, go on then. 0345 606 0973. Let's do that, because then you don't have to have a dog in the race in terms of the taxi trade or the minicab trade or anything like that, although men and women who do have dogs in those particular races are more than welcome to ring in. I'll need you to. But knowing what you know about self-employed status, knowing what you know about employment law, knowing what you know about national living wage and holiday pay, do you see why Uber can't classify its drivers as self-employed? And I would put delivery people on this list as well. It's a desperate attempt, before Brexit weaponises it, even before we come out of the European Union, it's a desperate attempt by capital, by investors, by the people who own almost everything, to erode what little rights the rest of us have left. They want us to essentially be, I genuinely believe this, I know it makes me sound like Wolfie Smith out of, I saw Robert Lindsay follows me on Twitter the other day. That seems like a beautiful piece of symmetry. But I know it sounds like the Tooting People's Front, but they genuinely want us, this is my sincere belief, there is a strand of conservative thinking, almost all of it allied with Brexit, that generally wants to reduce the British workforce to waiting on the dockside for a tap on the shoulder from the stevedore to tell you whether or not you've got a shift today. As many people as they can get into that category, whether it's a computer programmer or a minicab driver, if they can just have you ready and available for work but only have to pay you when they've got work, they win, 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 win. I told you, it always comes back to Capability Brown for me. I was Stately Home a couple of years ago, and they were describing the incredible effort. They rerouted a river, they removed a forest. Capability Brown, the landscape gardener, was doing some work for a massive aristocrat, and they wrote proudly in the accompanying literature about how 5,000 local villagers were employed for 18 months in digging out new rivers and moving trees. And my little girl and I were looking at it, and she was gobsmacked, and I turned to her and I said, what? I wonder what they were doing before and after. I wonder what those 5,000 villagers were doing before and after. And the answer is they were probably not earning any money, but they were ready and available for when an aristocrat decided that he wanted his river moving. I know why that introduction to this conversation about Uber ended up in a garden of a stately home of Capability Brown, but I am fully sympathetic to anybody listening who hasn't got a Scooby-Doo. These are the moments where I genuinely do despair, when I think the facts are so obvious when they're explained properly, as they have been to me, that I can't quite understand how anyone would resist them. I can find you the quote of someone like Liam Fox talking about how British competitiveness won't be restored until we've completely re-regulated labour, as if workers in this country have too much protection from their employers and too many rights. Priti Patel talking talking 2 or 3 years ago, another prominent Brexiter, about how when British people enter the workplace, they're among some of the most idle in the world. This is why people say, get over it, Brexit's over. The reason why it's never over until the fat lady has sat down after singing is because the lie that people have been sold is designed to damage their own lives. The notion that we need fewer protections in the workplace, the notion that the British worker is by definition idle, according to Priti Patel, the notion that we have too much health and safety. Too much health and safety. How can you have too much health and safety? Oh yeah, too much health, too much safety. That's one thing I hate is safety. Do you see what I mean? And yet, when it's gone through the mangle of the mail, these sort of things arrive in the inbox of the British public as negatives. The word do-gooder has been rendered negative. The word liberal, which means you believe in freedom, that's a negative. Yeah, all of these things are true, and the evidence is incontrovertible. And Uber is like the holy grail of this ideology. You look at the taxi drivers, self-employed, mostly working class people with the audacity to be earning, back in the day, decent livings, just like train drivers. How dare train drivers be earning that sort of money? I'm anti-elite. I hate train drivers. What? And that's what is underway. And that's why this case is huge, huge. Won't be reported that way in the Evening Standard because the editor of the Evening Standard gets an extremely large pay packet, the kind of pay packet that your average train driver would take 10 years to earn for doing a few hours a week in the pay of an investment fund that is one of Uber's biggest shareholders. Funny that, isn't it? I like that comparison. It would take a train driver 10 years to earn what George Osborne gets for 10 minutes work at Blackroll. I haven't done the sums. I'm just using that as a metaphorical exaggeration. But you take the point. And then you look at this case today. They resist furiously any attempt to give ordinary working people the national living wage and holiday pay. And still the mob cheers. Brexit will make it a hell of a lot easier. Get rid of national living wage. You won't even have the European Court of Human Rights to police these things. Do whatever they want. Get rid of unions. Kevin's in Borough. Kevin, what would you like to say?
James, first of all, thanks for putting our side of the arguments forward over the last couple of years. I'm sorry you get trolled a little bit too much.
To be honest with you, my quality filter, it's only about once a month now that anyone creeps through. One of my most assiduous trolls got completely owned on Twitter by Jack Munro, you know, the kind of food writer and campaigner. Yeah. It was a thing of beauty, but I would have missed that as well if someone hadn't pointed it out to me. They're not the sharpest tools in the box, these people who hate immigrants more than they love their livelihoods, are they?
No, I listen regularly, and I'll repeat myself again.
That's all right. That's all right. What did you ring in to say?
The self-employment thing, I'm a London taxi driver. I've got to file tax returns every year. Costs me money to do it, costs me time. I've asked how many people on the public hire side actually file tax returns as proof of self-employment. They're supposed to notify the tax man when they're self-employed. No one seems to know. No one seems to put that...
Well, anybody who's earning money is supposed to submit a tax return, and you're only supposed to. If you didn't, it would take a while for HMRC to come and kick your door in. It's a kind of... It's not a voluntary arrangement, but it is... There's no one holding a gun to your head saying that you've got to. So, theoretically, you could ask the same question about a taxi driver, Kevin, about a cab driver.
Well... Oh, no, we're under the threat of law, aren't we? If we don't file them tax returns...
Yeah, but so are they, if they've earned money. If the HMRC has evidence that they've earned any money and they haven't filed a tax return, they're under the threat of exactly the same law. There's no... This is a bit of a red herring, mate.
Do you think... Oh, well, I apologise. I thought that was a sure way of determining self-employment whether you file your tax returns.
No, if you're earning under a certain amount, then, I mean, you're not liable for income tax anyway. It opens up lots of grey areas, Uber, but I don't think this is one of the... leverage points. The leverage point would be, if you only had one client, would you still be allowed to describe yourself as self-employed while that client was... refusing... So you were only allowed to drive one passenger. This is how I think the comparison works better. You were only allowed to drive one passenger, and that passenger has said to you that if you're not needed, he's not going to pay you, but you're not allowed to drive anybody else while you're not driving him. He has a responsibility to pay you a national living wage or to pay you some holiday pay. Uber are trying to argue that he doesn't. That, I think, works better as a parallel.
I understand.
Mind how you go, Kevin. This is great for me as well. He may be right, I may be wrong, I'm not sure, but this is that Liam Fox quote I was referring to that Incorrigible FCA has dug out. To restore Britain's competitiveness, we must begin by deregulating the labour market. Political objections must be overridden. It is too difficult to hire and fire and too expensive to take on new employees. It is intellectually unsustainable to believe that workplace rights should remain untouchable while output and employment are clearly cyclical. You think I exaggerate? You just translate that into slightly more manageable and digestible English, and you have the Secretary of State for International Trade and key Brexiter Liam Fox telling you, as an ordinary working person of Britain who voted for Brexit because you thought you were going to improve your terms and conditions, that your terms and conditions are currently far too generous. Yeah. You know what the catchphrase of 2020 to 2040 is going to be in this country? It's going to be, you won, get over it. 11:28 is the time. More on this Uber coming up. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. How can an Uber driver be self-employed when every single time they do a job, they give money to an employer? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Hit the numbers now, you will get through. I don't know what we're going to do in the next hour. I may have some time with Lord Kerr, who wrote Article 50, the piece of legislation under which we are poised to leave the European Union. I'd love to ask him a couple of questions, because you know the Michael Gove-flavoured rejection of experts. I think it reached critical mass when people, I don't even need to name names anymore, do I? But people started claiming they had a better understanding of Article 50 than the bloke what wrote it. That was one of those moments where anybody who thought that reason was going to intervene on the Brexit story, or that emotion could ever be trumped by intellect, that is when I think they began to see the light and realise that you can't reason somebody out of a position they haven't been reasoned into. You had prominent Brexiters effectively arguing on this radio station that they had a better understanding of how Article 50 worked than the bloke who actually wrote it. Anyway, we're hoping to meet him before close of play today. It's not a taxi firm, is it? It's not a taxi firm. It's a minicab firm at best, but in fact it's a sort of radio switchboard system for drivers, Steve points out, and this is emblematic of how grey some of this coverage is. Plenty of places have already decided, as indeed London has, although that decision is being appealed, that Uber is not welcome in their countries or cities. It's been banned completely in Denmark, I think, because they have meters. Taxi meters are mandatory, which means Uber can't really operate there. Bulgaria suspended it for unfair trade practices. In Hungary, internet access has been blocked to what they described as illegal dispatcher services, and Uber argue that they fell under that umbrella unfairly, but under it they remain, or did at least when the article I'm referring to was written, which was in September of last year. I'll try and get more up-to-date stuff as well. Plenty of places in America, they had to pull out of operations in Alaska because they didn't want to pay their drivers compensation insurance. In Austin, Texas, the city's regulators told Uber they had to do fingerprint and background checks on their drivers before employing them, so Uber didn't want to and left. I'll say again, this is from September of last year, so if anything's changed in the ensuing 12 months, I'll do my best to establish that in the course of this conversation. So, I mean, leaving aside, of course, the fact that we are as a nation now embarked upon an act of epic self-destruction because a bunch of people have persuaded us that we'll be better off, when in fact they are quite open about the fact that they want us to be worse off. That reference to Priti Patel, the book I was referring to, was written by Kwesi Kwarteng, a fellow Tory MP and Brexiter, with contributions from Priti Patel, Dominic Raab, Chris Skidmore and Elizabeth Truss. It's all there. They didn't hide it. Britannia Unchanged, it was called, Global Lessons for Growth and Prosperity. And it was in that book that the point was made about British workers being among the most idle in the world. Chapter 4, work ethic. Once they enter the workplace, the British are among the worst idlers in the world. We work amongst the lowest hours, we retire early, and our productivity is poor. Whereas Indian children aspire to be doctors or businessmen, the British are more interested in football and pop music, say the arch Brexiters. Oddly, these comments aren't picked up by the likes of the Daily Express and the Daily Telegraph. It takes people like Incorrigible FCA and fellow anoraks to actually remember all of this stuff. You have Liam Fox saying that the rights that workers enjoy in this country are far too generous. So vote Brexit and wave goodbye to them. That's why Uber is so emblematic of bigger pictures and bigger problems. Jack's in Whitechapel. Jack, what would you like to say?
Well, thanks, technical. I'm going to go quick. I want to throw some stuff at you, James, and let me finish, and then just ask me some questions if anything has interested you. Is that all right?
Well, I'll cautiously agree to that, although okay, I reserve the right to ride roughshod over your polite request should the mood take me.
Thank you so much. I've got kind of some theories. I think we're to blame for the rise of Uber because we want stuff to...
Your line's gone funny, Jack. I'm not interrupting you. Just sort your phone out. Get your mouthpiece closer to your mouth. Take me off hands-free, whatever it may be.
What happens to the driver at Bob's Minicabs on the station? Is he self-employed or is he a worker? What happens to a black cab driver working for one of the big radio circuits? When they take a job over the radio through the app, do they then become self-employed or employed? And the other thing is that with regards to my company, we have self-employed drivers, but we say to them, look, come and earn as much as you can, but in those times when it's quiet, we actually pay them a guaranteed minimum to stay available. And that's what a lot of courier firms do in London, to try and bridge that gap that you're talking about, people sitting around. But if actually the customers paid the right price for that Uber driver, he could afford to sit around for half an hour and wait. But then you're giving him a job and you're paying him peanuts for it, or Uber are paying peanuts for it. We've got customers that I work for, and they say to me, we're paying £2.90 to go from left to right across central London. And I say to them, how many £2.90s do you think it's going to take for me to pay that guy enough money to earn his daily living? And what happens if I want to provide a service? I'm bridging that gap. And people are just so fixated with a race to paying the minimum amount, it doesn't allow you to pay your people what they should earn. Which is why they despise the national living wage, which would force them to either change their business practices or ship out of town. But what it's forcing me to do is I'm actually bridging that gap, and we're not making hardly anything, but I'm managing to stay in business. But it's the customers that need to just raise their game a little bit and say, look, actually, I'm not going to pay £2.90 for this guy to risk his life and limb in the wind and the rain in the middle of winter. But it's never going to happen, Jack. It's never going to happen, is it? Because for all the hot air... We're worth more than a coffee and a croissant. Yeah, but they're not. They're just going to look at the bottom line because we have... Well, I'll tell you why, very briefly, is because... Whether you're talking about a small company, the kind of company that Andrea Leadsom has previously tried to abolish all workers' rights for small companies. This is back in 2012 when she advocated abolishing workers' rights for small companies. The very simple reason is that the more money that you save, the more money goes into the pockets of your shareholders. So this is all about... Can't provide a service. Doesn't matter, does it? If you can get away with it... Look, say they paid £5, right? And then it goes down to £2.90. That's £2.10 left over for the shareholders. So the only way you stop it, no, it does with legislation. You need people to be able to earn money. You need legislation in place. So coming back to national living wage and no red herrings on self-employment. Are the radio taxi drivers, are they employed or self-employed on the app? I don't know, actually, is the short answer to that. I mean, they're not plying for hire. Drivers go on. Got enough money for the jobs that they were doing, they'd be happily self-employed if they were paid the right price. But you're talking about paying people £7 to go round the corner, and he's still got expenses for his car, for his Uber licence, for his insurance. And believe me, I don't use Uber. I've never used an Uber, right? But they also have expenses that they have to pay, and it's not enough money. It's not enough money. And there has been a time when black cab drivers have been too expensive, and basically they enjoyed rich profits at one point, and the minicabs kind of levelled that off in some way, shape, or form. I think most punters would probably have been happy with that until Uber came along and undercut the minicabs. But the reason they can't... because they can undercut the minicabs, because the terms and conditions under which they're operating aren't fair. And that's all the argument has ever been about. But politics is... I've got a fear, James. Go on. I've got a fear. Tell me. This is my fear. Tell me your fear. Some of this legislation that these drivers are taking Uber to court, is it possible that this is driven by the government to get people to pay tax who call themselves self-employed? They're not getting those taxes. And is it possible that this legislation could become so catastrophic for Bob's minicabs at the station who says, actually, I can't afford to stay in business, that we then flip it, and the only people that can afford it are Google, Goldman Sachs, and the likes of Uber to run a business. And then we lose those people.
You've lost me a bit. But if your fear is that Google and Goldman Sachs and those kind of outfits are embarked upon a process of world domination that's being facilitated by friendly politicians and supine journalists, then yes, I'd have to agree with you.
Same page.
And a pleasure getting there. Clive is in Woking. Clive, what would you like to say?
Well, first of all, can I have the same liberty my previous caller did, which was let me talk and then you can ask me at the end?
Carry on.
Okay, so this whole problem of what's self-employed and what's employed goes back for...
The reason being, Clive, the reason being is that it's a carte blanche for the world's biggest bores. So if you're boring, I will interrupt you. Carry on.
Let me have my say. So, proliferation of self-employment is across the board. Yeah, I'm self-employed. I invoice between 15 and 20 different people a month in, month out, yeah? There's been a huge growth of people in the middle ground who are working for a single company and another couple of people, and they are claiming to be self-employed. Even your researcher who answered the phone admitted she was in that camp.
Well, why would it be an admission?
So basically, I think HMRC needs to bring out firmer clarification of IR35 and what an employee is. That would clear a lot of this up through and through, because people like, say, Nick Ferrari on LBC, who turns up every day, 5 days a week, 48 weeks a year, is effectively an employee. He is not self-employed. Yeah? The same could be for David Dimbleby on Question Time. Once you get starting down that road with clarification on who fits an employee, who fits self-employment...
I'm sorry, you've bored me rigid now. I mean, I think I understand the point that you're making, but I was waiting politely for you to stop talking so that I could observe your request that I don't interrupt you, and I've got a horrible feeling you're never going to stop talking, Clive.
I've stopped.
Fantastic.
So,
it's 11:45. That one sums up the Uber situation quite like our Mr. James O.B. Some in our trade feel the need to dig him out. One word, mugs, writes Wilmo. To which I responded by pointing out that the people he's talking about, and there used to be loads of them before Twitter introduced quality filter and I started blocking and muting with gay abandon. So I know exactly what they're like and exactly what motivates them. So I described them thus. Talking about people whose hatred of immigrants is stronger than their love of their livelihoods. And I tweeted that half an hour or so ago, and quite a lot of you have picked up on it as a fairly neat emblem of everything that's happening in Britain at the moment. And you're right, I hadn't realised that. It's the sort of taxi driver Uber experience, or the taxi driver attitude to immigrants, or potential customers, as I would call them if I was a taxi driver, writ large across the country. Hatred of immigrants is stronger than love of anything. So what have you done by voting Brexit? Well, according to Liam Fox, Priti Patel and various other prominent Brexiters, you voted to have your rights in the workplace removed. Great, because immigrants. You won. Get over it. Mohammed's in Ilford. Mohammed, what would you like to say?
Hi there. Hi, how are you doing? Okay.
I think so, yeah. The way you ask me makes me wonder whether there's something you know that I don't.
I'm an Uber driver. I've been an Uber driver for almost 3 years now.
Yeah.
So I'm on 20% commission. Anyone after that was on 25%. Anyone joining that now is on 30%. Now, let me give an example. A minimum fare is £5. Now, our Uber take 20%, so you're left with £4.
Yeah.
Now, if you minus, like, insurance and the diesel cost and everything, we're left with literally nothing. We have to live off that. And basically what it is, Uber has become like a train and bus replacement. Really I would get more than a £10 fare. People just travel here to there. Now, I work hours and hours, and sometimes I can't even afford to take a day off because I'm always in a loss. But not all Uber drivers understand that, because I've been doing it for a long time. I can see that literally I've nothing to save up. On top of that, I want to make another point.
Go on.
Say, for example, all right, so people who use Uber generally don't want to spend too much money on a cab.
Sure.
Now, sometimes, like traffic, we don't have control over traffic and whatnot, so the prices go up. Now, what riders tend to do is they complain to Uber, and Uber automatically they adjust the fare. So how does that make us self-employed.
I don't know that that's true. I don't know that they automatically adjust the fare every time someone rings up and says this is a bit steep.
They do. I've experienced it.
No, but not every time a passenger says this is a bit steep, they say, all right, don't pay it. I mean, I'm not going to argue with you about that, because the more important point is that they set the fare that you can charge, which means you're working for them, and then you're giving them 20% of that fare as well. So the idea that you're self-employed seems ridiculous to me.
We are not so. I can 100% say that we're not self-employed. On top of that, every fare, we don't get paid directly. We get paid weekly.
No, I know all of that. Just hold your horses briefly, because here's what I want to ask you, and I think this is me kind of trying to employ the language of the kind of right-wing rhetorician. If Uber are ordered to do X, Y, and Z, and they say, well, we're going out of business, then what happens to you? So I guess did the right wing, the next chapter of the British reverse into 19th century economic values is this, Mohammed. The next chapter is, yeah, all right, you can moan all you want, pal, but at least you've got a job. And I don't know how you respond to that. If Uber say, OK, well, if you don't like it, get lost, or Uber say, we don't like the rules that the government have put in place, so we're going, what happens to your livelihood?
Well, I've got mouths to feed. I got to look after myself. I got rent to pay. What do? I can't go anywhere else. I mean, Uber could be here today. I'm not here tomorrow.
And what happens if it's not here tomorrow?
I'm literally jobless. I have to start looking for jobs. I've got no money saved up because I've been making a loss ever since I've been working for Uber.
I think one of us isn't quite getting this. I think it might be me for once rather than you. So let me try again. All of the complaints you make about Uber, what I'm wondering is whether working in those conditions, pretty rotten though they are, could be construed as better than the alternative, which would be no work at all, because that's where we're going next. You take this and we don't want to pay you the minimum wage, and we don't want to pay you holiday pay. Starts with Uber, ends up with everybody. None of us get the protections that we deserve, because the argument is that if you don't like it, you can lump it. Do you see what I mean?
I understand, yeah.
So what happens if Uber do take their ball home and walk away? You're worse off then than you are now.
That's absolutely right. But I mean, really don't know what to say. I mean, there has to be like some sort of justice. It's just injustice to us drivers. I mean, we were told one thing, but we weren't told the reality that if you minus everything, our diesel, our...
No, I get it, and that's why it has to be law, because no business, especially not one bankrolled by massive hedge funds and investment funds, is ever going to do anything voluntarily. Do you want me to tell you what Uber are saying have you had your message yet from them?
I haven't.
Okay, well, here you go, mate. This'll settle your nerves, Mohammed. This'll address all your concerns. Today, the First Stage Appeal Tribunal upheld last year's preliminary hearing that 2 former Uber partner drivers who brought an employment claim should be classed as workers rather than as self-employed. I think a slight misleading there, in that it's not just the 2 former Uber partner drivers who brought an employment claim who should be classed as workers, according to the court. It's every single Uber driver in the land. But anyway, we intend to appeal this decision again to protect the freedom and flexibility of drivers to be their own boss, which we know is valued by you, our partners. Whilst the appeal is ongoing, there will be no change to the way you use the Uber app. We'll keep you updated as this progresses. So, Mohammed, mate, you need to cheer up. You're having your freedom and flexibility protected.
At least we're getting somewhere finally. I mean, I believe these 2 individuals this court case was going on for a long time.
Yes, it was.
Very long time.
Backed by the IWGB. Wait for it. Train driver haters, the IWGB union. Otherwise, they never would have got to court without the support of a big organisation. Which is what they want. They want all the Mohammeds of this world to be lone operators with no power of recourse at all. But trade unions allow 1 million different voices to be heard as one enormous bellow, which is why the kind of people who've encouraged you to vote Brexit, so that they can get rid of the protections regarding employment rights, health and safety, you name it. Just don't take my word for it. Ask Liam Fox. Far too much regulation in the workplace in Britain today. Far too much. Far too much health and safety on building sites. I love it when I go to other countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, and I see people 40 floors up on scaffolding without crash helmets on or without proper harnesses. That's the kind of world we want to live in. 11:57 is the time. I've got another Mohammed on the line. Where was I last? This one's in Greenwich. Mohammed, what would you like to say?
Hello, good morning, James.
It is a name that pops up quite often among Uber drivers, Mohammed, isn't it?
Well, I was going to say I tick all the boxes. I think Jack earlier on, your caller earlier on, nicked my point. That,
Go on.
With the decision being made by the court to potentially class the Uber drivers as workers, and therefore eligible for minimum pay and holiday and so forth, this would then affect the 2,500 other operators in London?
As in the other minicab drivers?
Yes.
Possibly. I don't know what the terms and conditions are when you're driving a minicab.
Well, I mean, because this leads to the point that you were just discussing with the other Mohammed from Ilford. That what happens after, if Uber do walk away, Uber can quite happily write off London and other cities and carry on taking revenue from the other businesses they've got operating. But then, do you know what it is for me, mate? And I could be wrong, and I could be going down sort of peak undergraduate communist or whatever it is. As a general rule, when they say, with their hundreds of millions of dollars of backing, when they say, oh no, if this happens, we won't be able to afford... It's a bit like when they threaten to leave the country if Labour get elected, you know? Or they threaten to... you can think of your own example at this point. I can't quite believe that Uber, if it really is all that it's cracked up to be, can't afford to pay its workers, its drivers, minimum wage and holiday pay. I just can't believe it. But I do believe they never will unless they're forced to. I can agree with that on that, but on a personal level, myself, I was in the London bus industry for 6 years, working as a bus driver and then doing some operational work in the office. I resigned from that because it was literally a rolling 5 days over 7, and working shift patterns that were over 24 hours.
Yes.
So you're doing your earlies, middles and lates.
You were on a private, so you were working for a privatised bus company?
Contractors in London, on behalf of TfL. But
private contractors on behalf of TfL rather than, there aren't any state-run bus companies, I don't think, anymore. But they can own... This is what happens when you privatise stuff. The priority becomes the shareholder, not the worker.
Right. However, having resigned from that and walked away from it, borrowed some money from family to purchase a car and do the insurance, I'm now self-employed and 5 months in. So far, I'm quite happy.
Good.
Just on the level of flexibility from work.
But you'd be even happier, wouldn't you, if you got a national living wage and holiday pay?
That would be a conversation that would need to be had, because obviously if you go down that route, then there's going to be... other terms are going to change.
Well, so they'll say, because you're right, but you sound like a boiled frog, Mohammed. You sound like somebody who doesn't realise that things are being done to you, because they'll turn around and say, oh, well, if we're forced to give you national living wage and holiday pay, then we're going to have to take more than the percentage of your fare that we take now. And this is why you need collective bargaining power. Only with the backing of the IWGB can these two drivers, ex-drivers, former drivers, go to court and make their case. You can't make your case, so you end up being grateful for whatever crumbs fall from the shareholders' table, comrade.
Well, comrade, I'm quite happy on the terms that I've got. I know what I signed up for, and I know what I can earn. And if the day should come that I feel that I'm not getting, with 4 little ones, a mortgage, 2 cars, or whatever else to run, I'll turn around and have to go do something else. Yeah, no, and I completely respect that. I completely respect that. And nobody, I suppose, is going to force you to change your terms and conditions, but the law is the law, and the notion that you are self-employed is bogus, because you give 20% to Uber every time you take a job. Probably more, actually, if you've only joined them relatively. How much is it for you? For me, it's 25. But on that point, James, just cool. and one other, if I can, after.
No, you can't. Actually, you can't even do that point. I'm late for the news. Genuinely, it's 12:01. You can check your watch.